Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be learning about the human circulatory system. So we have some few objectives. Today we're just going to be looking at the structure of the circulatory system and its components basically. We're going to be looking at the blood vessels, which include the main three blood vessels are arteries, capillaries and veins. And we'll also be looking at the heart. In our next video we're going to be looking at the other objectives. It's a bit of a long chapter. So first, let's start with the function of the circulatory system. So the circulatory system has, for example, three main functions, okay? So the main function it has is for transportation, okay? So what does it transport? It transports essential materials such as oxygen, nutrients, and chemical messengers, which are hormones, into our blood tissues. How? So through the blood. So the component that's mainly used for transportation is blood, because blood is what passes through our blood vessels, and it also does not only transport nutrients, it also takes away wastes from the blood tissues, for example CO2, which we said is a byproduct from cellular respiration, and it also serves to transport heat evenly throughout the body and also helps in fighting infections. Okay, so we have two main components of the circulatory system. We have the heart, which is the pumping organ, okay, and we have blood vessels, and together they form up the circulatory system. Now, the blood vessels we said are split into three. We have arteries, capillaries, and veins, okay? So let's move to check out the how blood flows in our bodies basically, okay? So first we're going to start with arteries. So arteries have thick elastic muscular walls. Now, why do arteries have a thick elastic muscular wall? A reason for that is so they can withstand high pressures, okay? So blood pressure is usually the highest at the aorta, which is the artery in our heart, and as we're going to be looking at later on. So that's why arteries usually have thick and elastic, so they're able to recoil, okay? Muscular walls which withstand high pressure. And what do those muscular walls? It's made up of smooth muscles. What's their function? It's either for, if they contract, they're going to constrict, and if they relax, they're going to be dilated. So what's the difference between constriction and dilation? So constriction basically restricts blood flow, okay? So we have less blood passing through the artery, while dilation is the opposite, allows more blood to flow, okay? Now, what do arteries carry? They carry, most of them carry oxygenated blood, okay? So blood rich in oxygen. However, there's only one exception, which is the pulmonary artery, okay? And they carry deoxygenated blood, so they have low concentration of oxygen basically. Now, after the arteries, they're going to split into smaller arteries we call arterioles, and then we're going to reach the capillaries or capillary bed. So what are capillaries? Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, okay? What is their function? Their function is for exchange of materials, which are, for example, nutrients or wastes, between the blood and between the tissues, okay? And a characteristic of capillaries that allows them to have this function of exchange is that they have very thin walls. And as we saw in the respiratory system, we said in the alveoli we have gas exchange, and the alveoli also have thin walls to reduce the distance needed for gases to diffuse through. And here it is the same concept. So capillaries have a small thin wall, a very thin one. It's about 1 cell thick, allowing the nutrients and materials to be able to diffuse faster, okay? And also blood flow usually, so it's high and then it's decreasing, okay? Because pressure is also decreasing. So since blood flow is slow, there is more time for exchange to occur, and they can also form capillary beds. Now, after the capillaries, we move into the venules, which are small veins, and then they join together and form veins. Now, what is the difference between veins and arteries? So veins usually have thinner and less elastic walls. So what do you expect if they have thinner and less elastic walls? They're going to have a lower pressure over there. Because if they had a high pressure, their walls were ruptured, okay? And we don't want that to happen. That's why they have thin walls, because they have low pressure. Unlike in arteries, we have a thick elastic wall, so they're able to withstand the high pressure. And also some veins contain smooth muscles, so they can also constrict and dilate, but not the same amount as we have in arteries. And they also have valves. Now, why do they have valves? Okay, so before we talk about why we have valves, let's look at arteries and veins again. So as I wrote down here, arteries, what do arteries do? Arteries carry blood away from the heart, okay? So if you want a way to memorize it, arteries start with an A and away starts with an A. So AA, arteries take blood away from the heart, while veins carry blood to the heart, okay? And that's going to be very important when we talk about why veins have valves, okay? So for example, let's say those are our legs, those is a vein, and it's surrounded by, let's put the blue as muscle, okay? As skeletal muscles. Okay, let's say those are our calves. So since pressure, we said in veins, is low, and we want the blood to flow, because veins are gonna transport blood from the tissues to the heart. So we want them to go a distance up back to the heart. So from our legs up to the heart. Now, usually gravity pushes the blood down, okay? So it's pulling it down, but we want a high pressure in order to push it up. But since we have a low pressure, we have smooth muscles. What do those smooth muscles do? They basically contract, and when they contract, they squeeze the blood. So, for example, this is the blood. So those smooth skeletal muscles contract, squeezing the blood to pass through the valves and go back to the heart. And the main function of valves is to prevent backflow of blood. So once the blood passes through the valve, these valves shut, and it prevents blood from going back to where it was. And we have the same thing in the heart, which we will be looking at in our third objective, okay? And usually veins, what do they carry? They carry deoxygenated blood, and you also have one exception, which is the pulmonary vein. Okay, we're going to be looking at them again when we talk about the heart. Now this is an example. This is our artery, and those are our veins. And for example, here you're going to have small venues, and here you're going to have small arterioles, okay? And this is our capillary bed. Now we said the function of the circulatory system is to transport essential materials, okay? So oxygen, nutrient to our cells, and to take away wastes. So for example, here around we're going to have, for example, our tissues, okay? And we want exchange to happen. So let's say we had a nice meal, we had a nice lunch, okay? And we want the nutrients to pass from our blood into our tissues. So what's going to happen? We have sphincters here, okay? We talked about sphincters before in our video about the digestive system. So they are basically a layer of muscles which contract to close, or they relax to open. So when after a meal, so let's write it down. So after a meal, what happens to the sphincters? What do you guys think? So of course, if we want the blood to pass through the capillary bed in order to have the exchange occurring, the sphincters are going to relax. So after a meal, sphincters relax, allowing exchange to occur, okay? So exchange of materials to occur. But for example, let's say we have the meal, and then, for example, after 3 hours later, we don't have nutrients in our blood anymore, so we don't need the exchange to occur anymore. So what will happen to these sphincter muscles? They're going to, now they contract. So instead of the blood flowing through the capillary bed, it flows through something which we call a shunt, okay? So it basically skips going through the capillary bed and it directly passes into the veins, okay? And just one more note before we go and we talk about the heart. We talked about the valves before. We said the valves, what is their function? Their function is to prevent backflow of the blood. So also the heart has valves, and it's usually the function is to allow the unidirectional flow of blood, so blood can only flow through one direction and not bi-directional. And now let's move with me, guys. So we talk about the heart, okay? So this is not a perfect diagram, but I tried my best drawing the heart. So what does the heart contain, okay? Let me just get the markers. Okay, so the heart has 4 chambers, okay? So we have 4 chambers in the heart. What are they? You guys have to really know the structure of the heart to be able to understand its function. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we have 4 chambers. It is split into 2 by 2. We have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Okay, so we have the left atrium, the left ventricle, and we have the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay, and now so what is inside the left atrium? So inside, so we have here left and right, and same thing here, we have a left and a right. And now what are they separated by? So we have a septum, okay? A septum in the middle, as you guys can see, the black line, this one. Okay? It separates the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. Now why is that important to have that separation? Because on the left side of the heart, what do we carry? So on the left side, we have oxygenated blood. Okay, let's put it in green. We have oxygenated blood. While on the right side, what do we have? You guys can already tell. It's going to be deoxygenated blood. And of course, we don't want the oxygenated blood to mix with the deoxygenated blood. That's why we have a septum in the middle which separates them, okay? Now, we talked about the left atrium, the left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle. And those are the 4 main chambers of the heart. Now, also, the heart contains cardiac muscle. Now, what is special about cardiac muscles is that they contract by themselves. What does it mean they contract by themselves? That means they don't need nerve impulses. So for example, I can take my heart outside of my body and you're going to see the heart still pumping. That's why, because the tissue, the cardiac muscle tissue, can contract by itself and they don't need nerve impulses making them pump, sending impulses to make them pump. They just pump by themselves. And also, as any type of organ, okay, so the heart is an internal organ. As any type of organ, of course, it needs oxygen and nutrients, okay? And where does it get them from? It gets the oxygen and nutrients from coronary arteries, okay? So now we're going to talk about the blood flow, and by talking about the blood flow, we're going to learn about the valves, the aorta, the pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, everything you guys need to know, okay? So the blood flow, we're gonna explain it right now. So how does blood flow occur, okay? So first we have the vena cava, okay? It can be split into 2. We have a superior vena cava and we have an inferior vena cava, okay? What does superior and inferior? As you guys can tell, superior takes the deoxygenated blood from the upper half of our body and the inferior takes the deoxygenated blood from the lower half of our body. Okay? So what happens? So the vena cava carries what? Carries deoxygenated blood. Okay? It carries deoxygenated blood. So this deoxygenated blood is coming from the veins from our body, okay? After they've used up all the nutrients and they used the oxygen up, now we want to get the oxygen back, okay? So it carries deoxygenated blood. And then it's going to enter into the right atrium, okay? So deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium. Now what do you guys see over here? In green, you see a valve, okay? And usually this has, it's a 3 valve, okay? So this valve, what do we call it? We call it the tricuspid valve, okay? So let's write it here, tricuspid valve. Try it because we have 1, 2, 3, okay? And we call this also what type of valve? Atrioventricular valve. Why atrioventricular? From the name, you guys don't have to memorize it. Atrioventricular valve, okay? So if I want to split it, atria and ventricle. So it separates the atria from the ventricle. That's why it's called atrioventricular valve. So one of them is the tricuspid valve. Now after that deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, it's going to pass through the valve and enter the right ventricle. After the right ventricle, it's also going to pass through another valve. What's this valve called? We call it the pulmonary valve. And it belongs to semilunar valves. Okay, so semilunar valves has pulmonary valve. Now it goes from the right ventricle into what? The pulmonary artery. Now remember, what did we say about the pulmonary artery? It's one of the exceptions. We said arteries usually carry oxygenated blood. However here, what are the pulmonary arteries carrying? They're carrying deoxygenated blood. So the pulmonary artery takes blood into where? Try to assume. So we want blood into our oxygen. So it's going to take the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Okay? And remember, in the lungs we have gas exchange. We excrete carbon dioxide and we inhale oxygen. If you haven't watched my video about the respiratory system, make sure to watch it. So it goes into the lungs to get oxygenated. Now, in the lungs we have the gas exchange occurring and everything. We already spoke about it. Now, from the lungs, what do we have? The pulmonary vein coming. Because remember, veins take blood to the heart. Arteries, A for artery, away from the heart. Veins towards the heart. So now pulmonary vein is coming from the lungs. And how do I know? Pulmonary means lungs, veins to the heart. So pulmonary vein from the lungs to the heart. Now what does the pulmonary vein carry? Of course, if it's coming from the lungs, it's going to carry oxygenated blood. So oxygenated blood is going to come from the lungs. What's it going to enter? It's going to enter the left atrium. Now, after the left atrium, it's going to enter the left ventricle. However, what do we have here? We have a valve. What's this valve called? We call it the bicuspid valve. Why bicuspid? Because we only have 2. Or sometimes we call it the mitral. Okay, mitral valve. And of course, to which family of valves is it going to belong? Will it belong to the atrioventricular or into the semilunar? Of course, atrioventricular. Why? Because it's separating the atria from the ventricle. Okay, so it's going to be over here. Now after it enters the left ventricle, it's going to pass through another valve. What do we call this valve? We call it the aortic. Okay, aortic valve. And to what family of valves is it going to belong? Of course, into the semilunar. So we're gonna place it right here. Okay. From the left ventricle, it's going to go through the aorta, which is the largest artery, and of course, is it going to carry oxygenated or deoxygenated? Of course, it's going to carry oxygenated blood. Now, into where? Basically, to the entire body. It's going to split into smaller arteries and then arterioles and then capillary and the whole process again. But it carries, what you guys have to know, oxygenated blood into the tissues. And now just a small reminder from the respiratory system. What are our tissues going to do with that oxygen? They're going to perform cellular respiration. Okay? So that's mainly for the structure of the heart, the chambers, the valves, and how blood flows. Okay? Now we're also going to be looking about the cardiac cycle. Okay? So we already spoke about it a bit, and we're going to revise it again together, just so I make sure everyone understood it. So just small definitions before we talk about the cardiac cycle. Systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. Okay? So of course, around the heart, we're going to have a thick muscular elastic layer. Okay? Now of course, on the left side, it's going to be thicker from the right side. As you guys can see, I tried to show it in my diagram that the left side is thicker than the right side. Why is that? Because the left side is pumping at a higher pressure. Why at a higher pressure? Because remember, aorta, highest pressure. So we want the heart to be able to withstand this high pressure. That's why we have a thick elastic layer, which is able to recoil also. So when the high pressure comes, it's not going to burst, okay? It's going to be able to maintain its structure, okay? So just a small note that the left side of the heart has a thicker muscular layer surrounding it and is generally thicker, okay? So diastole is relaxation. Now what is the cardiac cycle? It's usually split into 3 phases. What are these 3 phases? We have diastole in the beginning, we have atrial systole, and we have ventricular systole, okay? So let's look again at the heart, okay? But let's just erase some stuff in order for you guys to be able to understand it more, okay? So we talked about the valves, we talked about the chambers of the heart, we talked about what they carry. Now let's look at the cardiac cycle. So first step is diastole. We said, what is diastole? Diastole is the relaxation. So basically, our atria are just filling up with blood. So the vena cava is carrying deoxygenated blood into the atria. Remember, the valves, okay, so usually are open. Okay, so blood can still pass through the right ventricle, but not all the blood in the atria is gonna go into the right ventricle and diastole, okay, because the muscles are relaxed. There's no contraction happening yet. Okay, so the atria of both the right atria and the left atria are filling up with blood. So I'm gonna write it here. So in diastole, we have filling up of atria. Okay, both the left and the right, they're just filling up with blood. Then we have atrial systole. What did we say systole is? Contraction. So what do we expect now? We expect the atria to contract. Okay, so think about it. They're contracting, they're squeezing. Okay, they're squeezing the blood to pass through the valve into the left ventricle. Now what's happening in atrial systole? Okay, what's happening is as the contraction is happening, we have a higher pressure in the atria than the ventricle. That causes the valves to open, okay, and make sure every bit of blood that's in the atria to go into the ventricle. Okay, so just imagine this squeezing through like a juice box. You squeeze it to make sure everything goes out. So that's basically what's happening in atrial systole. So in atrial systole, we have the atrioventricular valves open. So I'm gonna write the bicuspid plus tricuspid valves are open. Now, what do you think about the semilunar valves? Of course, they're going to be closed, okay? So the semilunar valves are closed. So semilunar valves are closed, okay? So basically, let's just repeat it again. Diastole, we just have filling up of our atria. Atriosystole, our atria are contracting, making sure all the blood is going into the ventricles. And of course, we have the bicuspid valves open and the tricuspid valves open, while of course the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve are closed. Now, if we move into our final phase in our cardiac cycle, is the ventricular systole. Now, what happens in the ventricular systole? From its name, ventricular, so we're looking at the ventricles now. Systole, what does systole mean? Systoles mean contraction. So now our ventricles are going to contract. So when our ventricles are contracting, they have a higher pressure. Now we have higher pressure in the ventricle than in the aorta, and we also have a higher pressure in the right ventricle than in the pulmonary artery. So since we have high pressure, low pressure, what's going to happen to this valve? It's going to open, okay? So the semilunar valves are going to open up, because why are they going to open up? Because we have high pressure, and over here we have a lower pressure, okay? So ventricular systole, and of course again, what happens to the bicuspid and the tricuspid? If this is open, this is closed. So here it's just the opposite. So here they're going to be closed, while the semilunar are going to be open, okay? So in ventricular systole, we have a higher pressure in the ventricles than in the aorta, than in the pulmonary artery, which is going to lead to the semilunar valves opening up, allowing blood to move from the left ventricle into the aorta and then into the body, and then from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery and into the lungs. Now, what stimulates the contraction of the atria? So as you guys can see, we have a small, over here in the right atrium, something called the SA node. It's also known as the heart pacemaker, okay? This basically sends impulses to the atria to contract, and it also extends, okay? So it has fibers that extend throughout the heart to stimulate also ventricle systole, but we have another node for that, which is called the AV node, but I did not mention it because it's not needed for the IGCSE. However, if you want to know about it, it's basically you have another node which is responsible for the ventricular systole. It's called the AV node. So the signal passes from the SA node, stimulates the atria, and then that signal transmits into the AV node, contracts the ventricles, okay, through fibers, and the opening and closing of the valves, as we mentioned before. So as you guys could see from the heart, the function of the valves is to prevent backflow. So when those in ventricular systole, when those valves opened up, why did those close? Because we don't want the blood that was in the ventricle to go back into the atrium, okay? Because it's going to be a disaster if we have blood leaking through, okay? So that's why these, make sure they're closed so blood can easily go through one valve into the heart and maintain its pressure. And we talk about the cardiac cycle, and just a small note about the cardiac cycle, it occurs very fast, okay? So this process, maybe in a second and it's done, okay? So don't think about it, it's taking time, it's super quick, and it has to be quick. And that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below, and stay tuned for part 2.